Thank you for joining me today on Leading Today. Today's episode is about one of the most underused high impact tools in a leader's toolkit. Do you know what they are? They are the words, I was wrong or I'm sorry. So most leaders will invest in strategy decks, team offsites, team building, dashboards, so forth and so on, but most hesitate to offer a simple apology to their staff even when they know they messed up. My name is Dr. Lisa Bagby, and I've studied emotional intelligence and leadership and what it is to take leaders from good to great. Emotional intelligence, as I've studied, includes several competencies, but these are the ones I've studied and identified. They are self-reflection, self-awareness, emotional self-management, and then empathy and compassion, which many tend to see as very similar. But the thing is, apologies touch and intersect across all of these competencies. Through my own research and studies, I've read and written that self-reflection and self-awareness are two key factors that all leaders who want to be great leaders must harness and practice. Here's a quick stat for you to think about. From a LinkedIn article that I recently read, it explained research on psychological safety in teams shows that the best performing teams are not the ones that make fewer mistakes, but the ones that talk about them openly, which starts with the leaders admitting their own errors. So let's talk about the one EI element most leaders miss. It is about apologizing to your staff or team when you're wrong and how it can transform the actual way you lead. I know. As leaders, we don't think about that. And actually, we fear taking such an action. It's understandable. It's actually human. But apologies are an act of humility. So let's talk about the fears a little bit. Why do leaders avoid apologizing? Well, various fears are attributed to why leaders don't apologize, but we're going to normalize them in today's conversation by naming them. So one is the fear of losing authority, saying, if I admit I was wrong, they'll lose respect for me. It's understandable, but in fact, it makes you more human. So you may actually gain more respect by apologizing. It's part of the perfection trap. It's the belief that leadership equals always knowing and never misstepping. And then there's, of course, what we call power distance, for which every culture has an aspect of this. And it shapes how an apology is made, or in some cases, even not, depending on the culture, but how it is made by a leader. And in the US, leaders may tend toward power distance, thinking of apologies like, I'm the boss, or apologizing makes me look weak. But let's reframe that a little bit. Let's talk about some of the data and the way that apologies impact outcomes. There are some studies and case examples that show that sincere leader apologies increase trust. Satisfaction with one's manager as well is an outcome, as well as employee engagement when compared with no apology or a fake one. And think about that. It shouldn't be performative. It should be authentic. Now, depending, you may do that to the team as a whole or an individual whom you know may have somehow been affected by what was said or not said, giving them that apology and rebuilding that trust and actually gaining some respect. So, if the fear is that apologizing will weaken you, the reality is actually the opposite. So, let's take a look at what a good apology actually does for a team. It does three things, okay? And it's really grounded in three concrete impacts, all linked to one's emotional intelligence, or EQ as it's sometimes referred to. So it rebuilds trust and psychological safety. A leader apology validates people's experience and it builds up the trust bank, quote unquote. In turn, that signals that it's safe to be honest and human at work. The other is that this kind of safety is linked to positive learning behaviors. Like we all want our teams to be learning and be receptive to learning. It helps with better error reporting and improved performance. Now, it may not be quite so clear like how that can be, but think about it for a moment. If you're in a classroom setting and the instructor or the teacher is giving you the space to share either an argument, a point of view, an understanding, even a quote from something you read, but that it's erroneous. But the instructor acknowledges it in a manner that doesn't make you feel small or where you somehow feel like you need to apologize, right? That you were wrong. The idea is that it's making the space and the room for learning to happen. So if you also extrapolate this to a healthcare setting where it's very important, you are talking about people's lives. Mortality and morbidity rates can be impacted in a positive way in the sense of they are reduced because people are not afraid to speak up and either report an error, acknowledge an error, raise a hand about a potential error getting ready to occur. So you want to have that kind of safety in a space where you are leading a team, or maybe you're a surgeon and you're the person obviously leading that surgery. You want people to be able to speak up because it's going to improve the safety of the patient and everybody else probably that is around them. So give that consideration. But an apology also reduces conflict, it reduces resentment, it has a host of other outcomes that when you apologize will ultimately make your team feel much, much better. The other component is that it leads to improved performance. If someone is not fearful of asking questions, speaking up, or knowing that their information or their question is going to be received in a manner that helps foster their own performance, then the apology or the psychological safety, rather, is going to ensure that that person feels that they can lean in towards performing at their highest potential. And even if they don't know fully what that is, it is likely going to help them lean into the learning of how to perform at the best of their potential. But the other is, as I mentioned, an apology also reduces conflict and resentment. You want to address the mistake. The unaddressed mistakes are the ones that fester, and those end up showing up as passive resistance, quiet quitting, which you may have heard of, or those side kind of water cooler conversations. So if you are trying to create organizational change, you probably know that passive resistance or quiet quitting makes that super hard. It's so much harder to create change when you have those kinds of resistances in the way. The other is you want to make it timely. Your apology should be done in a timely manner and it should acknowledge the hurt or the frustration. And that would easily help to de escalate any kind of tension. It helps clear the space for problem solving really very quickly. An apology, I say all the time, is something that is a couple of words that can be so healing. But an apology also models leader accountability and a growth mindset, actually. When leaders own their mistakes, they show that accountability is valued more than image. So ultimately, your leader image is your brand, right? So, how do you want to be perceived? As a humble and trustworthy leader or one who's only interested in saving face? You have to remember that teams are more likely to admit their own errors, share learning, and innovate when the leader goes first. So, I can tell you about a story that was shared with me where there was a young man who had done a lot of data research, had put together a storyboard behind it to present to a group of leaders that he really needed to build credibility with and a certain amount of trust. These leaders were, a little challenging to influence for, some of their own reasons. But that said, is the young man shared the data information with his leader and wanted to just make sure that the leader knew about the information and was prepared to share it in the next senior leader meeting. This individual and the leader came into the meeting together, and the leader opened up the meeting with the typical addresses you would do at the start of any meeting and began to open up the slide deck and started talking through some high level information initially, just to kind of ice break and acclimate the leadership team who was invited to attend this particular meeting. However, when it was time for the data story that the young man had prepared and for him to speak to it, the floor was not given to him. The leader instead continued through the slides and talked through all of that information as if it were his own. And unfortunately, the young man never had been mentioned as the individual who researched, who had put together the data story, which was actually to create a compelling business case for the organization to take a certain action. When the meeting was over, of course, the young man felt pretty betrayed, and good for him that he took the time to reach out to his leader and open a conversation about what happened. The leader was apologetic first, let me say that, but he realized in his eagerness to share the data story, he neglected to not only give credit to the gentleman who had actually pulled all this data together, but he did not turn the deck over to the gentleman to speak to it. He was the one most close to the information to be able to share it in an intelligent and insightful way. But the damage was deeper than that. The damage was deeper than that because, as stated in the beginning, the gentleman was also looking to use this data story to build the credibility and engender the trust of the leaders, the senior leaders, that he had been trying to work with most closely and who had been somewhat reticent to lean into the kind of professional that he was and the information that he was trying to bring so that the organization could make some change. To his leader's credit, the apology was, of course, healing, but it couldn't replace the moment that was lost. But just know that at least their relationship wasn't damaged for it. Credit to both of them. But it's something to think about, and knowing that in that moment, the leader could have chosen not to apologize at all and just leave it be. But luckily to the leader, he had the kind of emotional intelligence to recognize that he misstepped and he knew he owed something to his team person, that he could help make up ground for that. So, just a short story there that this may have happened, or you may be familiar with something similar. And if it has, or if you know someone who has shared such an experience, encourage the apology, even if it's been a little bit late. Encourage the apology nonetheless. That accountability becomes very important. And as I said, very healing. It can close a gap. So, just know that the apology is really very powerful, right? And you don't want to get that wrong. Ideally, do it in the moment or as soon after the moment has passed where it is appropriate. But it really does also come down to how the leader apologizes. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a powerful leader apology. So there's really like a simple structure, I guess you could look at it. And you can think of a strong leader apology as having 5 parts. You can practice these just like any other leadership skill. So, one is specific ownership. You want to name exactly what you did. So, for instance, say yesterday in the meeting, I cut you off and I dismissed your idea, and then apologize for that. So, the acknowledgement is really very important. But the vague apologies, where it's just very broad brushstrokes saying things like, oh, I made a mistake, or oh, mistakes were made, those really undermine trust and they're not really demonstrating responsibility. The other is impact awareness, or, what we could also call is empathy. You have to be able to acknowledge or recognize the effect on others. And you can say something like, I imagine that felt very disrespectful and discouraging, especially given the work you put in. That is essentially the type of apology and impact awareness that the leader in the story that I just talked about had leaned into. So, this kind of approach is really emotional intelligence in action. It's really tuning into others' emotional reality, not just your intention. The other is making it a clear apology. You want to use the actual words, I was wrong and I'm sorry. I know that that might sound difficult for someone to do, but practice that because, as I said, it's very healing. If you're interested in trying to make sure that you have good team relationships, those words can make the difference. So don't add any add-ons to it. Don't make excuses like I'm sorry, but I was under pressure, because all that's doing is allowing space for the blame to actually shift. It kind of moves over to circumstances or maybe in some cases other people, and that just shouldn't be the situation. You want to make a commitment to do it differently. Offer a concrete behavioral shift. The next time I'll pause and I'll ask for your full input before giving my point of view. Or, if you see me slipping, please come see me and call me out on it in a room or an office after the meeting. Just offering up the space for someone to call your attention to it and that you want to actually do something better or different the next time around. But this takes the opportunity of the apology moving from a moment and into a learning loop. And once you've done this a couple of times, because believe me, we all make more than one mistake and we shouldn't be afraid of it. But once we've learned this, it becomes a lot easier. That humility goes so far, and suddenly you become the leader who is a champion. Your team, your department, your division begins to see you as that leader that has their back, that leader who is humble, that leader who is willing to acknowledge the misstep, sometimes in front of a team, but that trust and that support and that loyalty that you get from your team in return is immeasurable. So here's a mini self reflection practice for you. I want you to think of a recent moment where you overreacted. Maybe you ignored input or you made a decision that hurt your team's trust. How would you rewrite that moment using these 5 parts that I just went over? And what I want you to do is actually sit down and draft the sentences. Like use the 5 parts and put that together. So just know strong apologies are part technique, part courage. So, how can you start strengthening this muscle in your regular leadership practices? Well, in my leadership workbook, which is coming out soon, that will actually help you strengthen that muscle for one. It's called Leading Today, and it should release in the first or second quarter of 2026 if it is not already out. But you want to take some actionable kinds of steps. And here's a few tips. Start small and timely. Don't wait weeks. Even a brief same day apology can really shift the tone very, very quickly. And be mindful of the nonverbals, right? So your eye contact, your tone, you want to have a calm tone. You don't want to have sarcasm or joking like you're joking it away. People will really feel and hear sincerity before they even analyze the words. So tone is really important. The other is separating the apology from attack. So I want you to listen to these 2 statements, okay? The first one is, I made a poor decision. And the other is, I'm a terrible leader. There's difference in those, right? The emotional intelligence piece is really about owning the behavior without collapsing your identity. And I think that's where the avoidance comes in. So let's make sure that we're approaching an apology in the right way. But you want to build this kind of action into your team norms also. It's not just you as a leader doing this. This is a practice that you are looking for and expect your teams to demonstrate. And so you'll explicitly state that, acknowledging mistakes, yourself included, is part of how your team works. And this is how you normalize that behavior, and therefore it is far less dramatic and maybe no drama at all. It's not that the apology loses its importance, but it becomes the same part of the fabric of team interconnectedness, as easy as like saying hello or goodbye at the start or the end of your day. The apology is a part of that fabric of your team. So I want to give you all some books that you can kind of use to deepen your EQ, your emotional intelligence. And think about some of these books. If you have them, go back and refresh. If not, I encourage you go out and either rent them on Libby, which is the online library resource, or pick them up from Amazon if you like. But Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. Hopefully, most of you as listeners have heard of this, but this one is a foundational look at emotional intelligence competencies like self awareness, like empathy, relationship management, all of these which really underpin genuine apologies. The other is Brene Brown's book called Dare to Lead. This is where she explores vulnerability and courageous conversations, including owning mistakes and repairing trust. Another one is Simon Sinek. Now, I love Simon Sinek. So his is called Leaders Eat Last. And this is where he emphasizes creating safe, trusting teams where leader humility and accountability are central. And then again, I invite you to use my upcoming leadership development workbook, Leading Today. As I said, this is releasing in 2026. And it's a really good development workbook that has a couple of short stories in there. It's got lots of reflection questions in there to really help leaders as well as trainers to strengthen this specific element. You can reflect on how you can build apologies into your daily work. But overall, it's really about building the emotional intelligence. So, to close, here's a question you can take into your week and maybe even into your next team meeting. What relationship on your team would change most if you offered one honest apology that you know you've been avoiding? What are you afraid might happen if you apologize? And what might become possible if you did? What story are you telling yourself about leadership that keeps you from saying, I was wrong and I'm sorry? I encourage you to choose one concrete conversation in the next week where you will practice this, okay? Leadership isn't proven by never being wrong. It is proven by what you do after you realize you are. So until next time on Leading Today, lead with courage and don't underestimate the power of a sincere apology. I'm Dr. Lisa Bagby. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe and share this podcast. Have a great day leading today.